December 19, 1976. Vandenberg Air Force Base, California. The winter air over the Pacific coast carried a peculiar weight that morning, not from the saltwater haze or the chill that gripped the launch complex, but from the knowledge that what sat atop the Titan IIID rocket represented a technological leap, so profound that most Soviet military planners would have dismissed it as fantasy. Inside the climate-controlled assembly building, National Reconnaissance Office engineers conducted their final checks on a satellite unlike anything that had ever reached orbit. It was designated Program 1010, codenamed KNNEN and officially catalogued as KH-11. The vehicle measured 65 feet in length, weighed 40,000 pounds, and resembled nothing so much as the Hubble Space Telescope that would follow it into orbit 14 years later. But where Hubble would peer into the depths of space searching for distant galaxies, this machine was pointed downward, calibrated for a single unforgiving purpose: to see Soviet missile silos, submarine pens, bomber bases, and armored divisions with a clarity and speed that Moscow had publicly declared impossible. Soviet military intelligence had spent years analyzing American reconnaissance satellites with a mixture of dismissal and carefully concealed anxiety. They understood the KH-8 Gambit and KH-9 Hexagon programs well enough. Those satellites used film, which meant they exposed images on strips of photographic material that had to be loaded into re-entry capsules, ejected from orbit, caught in midair by specially equipped aircraft, transported to secure facilities developed in chemical baths, dried, analyzed by trained interpreters, and only then delivered to decision-makers in Washington. The entire process consumed days, sometimes weeks. For Soviet planners, that delay was a shield. By the time American intelligence officers saw a photograph of a new SS-18 missile complex under construction in the Urals, the concrete could be poured, the silos reinforced, and the warheads installed. The Kremlin operated on the assumption that what happened today would not be seen in Washington until next week, and what was seen next week could be concealed, camouflaged, or relocated by the time countermeasures were contemplated. In classified assessments circulated among the GRU and KGB, Soviet analysts argued that real-time satellite reconnaissance was a technological impossibility, constrained by the fundamental limitations of data transmission, optical resolution, orbital mechanics, and atmospheric interference. They calculated that even if the Americans somehow developed a camera capable of taking digital images from space, the bandwidth required to transmit high-resolution photographs would exceed anything a satellite could generate, and the power requirements would drain batteries faster than solar panels could recharge them. It was a fortress of physics, or so they believed. What Soviet intelligence failed to anticipate was the revolution unfolding in a secure laboratory at Bell Telephone Laboratories in New Jersey, where researchers funded by the Central Intelligence Agency were perfecting something called a charge-coupled device. The CCD was an array of light-sensitive diodes that converted photons into electrical signals, effectively turning an image into a stream of data that could be transmitted via radio. This was not film. There were no chemicals, no re-entry vehicles, no parachutes, no aircraft recoveries. Light entered the telescope, struck the CCD array, and within moments became a digital signal beaming toward relay satellites and ground stations. The concept had existed since the early 1960s, when CIA official Albert Whelan watched a football game on his television and realized that if a communications satellite could transmit live video of a sporting event, then a reconnaissance satellite could transmit live images of Soviet military installations. But the technology was not mature. Early CCD arrays were primitive, with resolutions measured in mere hundreds of pixels. Film remained superior in every measurable way. It could capture thousands of high-resolution images in rapid succession, required no electrical power beyond the camera motor, and stored data with a density no electronic sensor could match. Throughout the 1960s, every attempt to build a satellite with electronic readout capability ended in failure or cancellation. The SAMOS program, which used film that was developed onboard the spacecraft and scanned with a flying spot scanner, proved so inefficient that a single 3-day Corona film return mission could collect more intelligence than 10 ground stations supporting 2 SAMOS satellites operating for 40 days. The program was canceled. Alternative approaches using electrostatic tape, thermoplastic tape, and photoemissive tape all failed to meet operational requirements. By 1964, the National Reconnaissance Office had effectively abandoned electronic reconnaissance in favor of film return systems that worked. Yet a small cadre of CIA officials refused to accept that conclusion. Leslie Dirks, tasked by Whelan in 1963 to develop a near-real-time reconnaissance system, continued funding research into CCD technology under a program codenamed Zoster, later renamed ZAMAN. Dirks visited Bell Labs and saw early-stage work on charge-coupled devices intended for video phones. The arrays were crude, but Dirks understood that the technology could mature. If it did, it would render Soviet concealment strategies obsolete. The CIA provided classified funding to accelerate development, betting that within a decade the arrays would be large enough, sensitive enough, and reliable enough to replace film. That gamble faced fierce opposition. The National Reconnaissance Office, dominated by Air Force officers and contractors who had built their careers on film-return satellites, viewed electronic imaging as unproven and wasteful. They proposed an alternative, film readout gambit or FROG, which would use a high-resolution camera to expose film, develop it onboard the spacecraft using a BIMET chemical process, scan it with a laser, and transmit the scanned images to a ground station. FROG was conservative, incremental, and based on proven technology. It would provide near real-time capability without the risk of betting everything on an immature sensor. The debate consumed the late 1960s with bitter fights erupting in classified meetings of the NRO Executive Committee. Air Force officials argued for FROG. CIA officials argued for ZAMAN. The breakthrough came from an unexpected advocate, Edwin Land, the billionaire founder of Polaroid and inventor of instant photography. Land had been advising the government on reconnaissance cameras since the 1950s and commanded immense respect within the intelligence community. In 1968, he chaired a panel that reviewed the state of readout technology and delivered a verdict that would decide the future of American satellite reconnaissance. Land reported to President Johnson's science advisor that the necessary technology for a See It Now system had become available. He identified three critical capabilities: satellites capable of operating for a year or more in orbit, high data rates via satellite-to-satellite relay, and the emerging maturity of electro-optical imaging technology. Land was not interested in film readout. He believed that solid-state CCD arrays represented the future and should be funded at full scale, even at the expense of current operating capability. His opinion carried such weight that it effectively ended the FROG program and cleared the path for ZAMAN, soon to be renamed KN. The final decisive moment came in August 1968, when Soviet forces invaded Czechoslovakia. A Corona satellite had photographed Soviet armored divisions massing on the Czech border days before the invasion, but the film capsule was not recovered and processed until after Soviet tanks had already rolled into Prague. Intelligence analysts stared at photographs showing exactly where the invasion forces had assembled, but they had seen those photographs 48 hours too late to warn policymakers or prepare a response. The failure was not technological. Corona had done its job perfectly. The failure was temporal. The intelligence community could tell the president what the Soviets had done, but not what they were doing. That single event, more than any technical argument, convinced senior officials that near real-time reconnaissance was not a luxury but a strategic necessity. Development began in earnest in 1971 under the management of the National Reconnaissance Office, with Lockheed Missiles and Space Company in Sunnyvale, California, serving as the prime contractor. Eastman Kodak, which had decades of experience building large-aperture optics for reconnaissance satellites, was selected to manufacture the telescope. The design specifications were extraordinary. The primary mirror measured 2.4 meters in diameter, identical to the mirror that would later fly aboard the Hubble Space Telescope. Some analysts believe that NASA's Hubble was in fact built using surplus optics originally fabricated for the KH-11 program, though this has never been officially confirmed. The mirror was designed to focus light onto a CCD array capable of resolving objects as small as 15 centimeters from an orbital altitude of 200 miles. This was not theoretical resolution, it was operational capability verified in classified testing. The satellite would orbit the Earth every 90 minutes, passing over Soviet territory multiple times per day, photographing missile fields, naval bases, bomber installations, and armored formations. But unlike every previous reconnaissance satellite, it would not wait days or weeks to deliver those images. The photographs would be converted into digital signals and transmitted in near real-time via relay satellites from the Satellite Data System constellation, which operated in highly elliptical orbits designed to maintain continuous line-of-sight communication with both the reconnaissance satellite and ground stations in the continental United States. The data would arrive at processing centers outside Washington within minutes of being captured. Analysts could see Soviet military activity as it happened, not as it had happened days earlier. The implications were staggering. Soviet deception operations, which had been meticulously designed to exploit the multi-day delay in American reconnaissance, would collapse overnight. Soviet military doctrine relied heavily on maskirovka, the systematic use of camouflage, concealment, and deception to hide military preparations from enemy intelligence. Soviet engineers had developed elaborate techniques for disguising missile sites, constructing inflatable decoy tanks and aircraft, building false radar installations, and timing military exercises to occur between satellite passes. These methods worked against film-return satellites because by the time analysts in Washington identified a deception operation, Soviet forces had already moved to their actual positions and the next satellite pass was days away. Against KH-11, those tactics would fail. The satellite could photograph a suspected decoy installation in the morning, analysts could identify it as fake by early afternoon, and a follow-up pass the next day could confirm that the decoys had been dismantled and reveal the actual equipment hidden nearby. On December 19, 1976, at 1400 hours local time, the Titan IIID rocket ignited. The launch was classified at the highest levels of secrecy. No public announcement was made. The payload was described only as a national security satellite. The rocket climbed through the coastal fog, arced over the Pacific, and inserted the KH-11 into a polar orbit inclined at 97 degrees, allowing it to pass over virtually every point on Earth as the planet rotated beneath it. Within hours, the satellite deployed its solar panels, activated its systems, and began taking photographs. The first images transmitted to Earth were test shots of the California coast, verifying that the optics, sensors, and data links were functioning. Then the satellite turned its attention toward its primary targets. On January 20, 1977, the day after President Jimmy Carter was inaugurated, CIA Director E. Henry Notch entered the Oval Office carrying something extraordinary: satellite photographs taken the previous day of Carter's own inauguration. The images showed the crowds gathered on the National Mall, the presidential podium, and the security perimeters with stunning clarity. Carter was astonished. Notch explained that the photos had been taken by a satellite launched just weeks earlier, and that the same satellite was now photographing Soviet military installations with the same resolution and delivering those images within hours. The president grasped immediately what this meant. For the first time in history, American intelligence could monitor Soviet military movements in near real time, providing warning of mobilizations, deployments, and preparations for conflict before those actions could be completed or concealed. Soviet military intelligence detected the KH-11 within days of its launch. Ground-based radars tracked its orbital path, calculated its revisit intervals, and attempted to predict when it would pass over sensitive installations. But they could not stop it. The satellite operated at an altitude beyond the reach of any Soviet anti-satellite weapon then in service. The USSR had tested co-orbital interceptors designed to rendezvous with and destroy satellites, but those systems were slow, unreliable, and required advance notice to position the interceptor in the correct orbit. By the time Soviet commanders received warning that a KH-11 pass was imminent, the satellite had already photographed the target and transmitted the imagery to relay satellites beyond Soviet reach. There was no defense. Soviet deception efforts, which had been effective against film-return satellites, collapsed. Previously, Soviet engineers would construct inflatable decoys of missiles, position them in fake silos, and rely on the days-long delay in American reconnaissance to create confusion. By the time analysts in Washington saw the decoys, the real missiles had been moved to actual silos and concealed. Against KH-11, that tactic failed. The satellite could photograph a site in the morning, analysts could identify decoys by afternoon, and a follow-up pass the next day could confirm that the inflatable missiles had been deflated and relocated. The Kremlin faced a new reality. The United States could see through their deception in real time. Initially, Soviet intelligence misclassified the KH-11 as a non-photographic satellite, possibly an electronic intelligence platform or a communications relay. This misconception allowed the satellite to operate for nearly 2 years without prompting significant changes in Soviet camouflage procedures. Analysts at the National Photographic Interpretation Center in Washington noticed that Soviet military installations were being photographed with unprecedented clarity, and that Soviet forces were making no effort to conceal their activities from overhead reconnaissance. Tanks were parked in open fields. Missiles were transported on railroads in broad daylight. Submarine construction facilities operated with bay doors open. It was as if the Soviets believed they were invisible. Then in early 1978, everything changed. Analysts began noticing a sudden and dramatic increase in Soviet camouflage efforts. SS-20 mobile missiles, which had previously been photographed in transit and at deployment sites, disappeared from view. Backfire bombers, which had been openly parked at airbases, were now hidden under camouflage netting or moved into hardened shelters. Construction activity at ICBM fields ceased during predicted satellite overflight times and resumed immediately afterward. The shift was so abrupt and so comprehensive that it could only mean one thing. The Soviets had obtained detailed information about KH-11's capabilities. The Defense Intelligence Agency and CIA launched an immediate investigation. Analysts reviewed every classified briefing, every technical document, every personnel file associated with the KH-11 program, searching for the source of the leak. The investigation focused on the National Photographic Interpretation Center, where analysts worked directly with KH-11 imagery and had access to technical manuals describing the satellite's capabilities. In November 1978, investigators identified a former CIA employee named William Campbell, who had worked as a watch officer at NPIC before resigning in 1977. Campbell had smuggled a top-secret KH-11 technical manual out of the facility by hiding it in his clothing and walking past security. In February 1978, he traveled to Athens, Greece, where he met with Soviet intelligence officers and sold them the manual for $3,000. The manual contained detailed specifications of the satellite's imaging resolution, orbital parameters, transmission frequencies, and operational procedures. It explained exactly what the satellite could see when it would pass over specific locations and how interpreters analyzed the imagery it collected. The Soviets now understood that KH-11 was not a communications satellite or an electronic intelligence platform, but a real-time photographic reconnaissance system capable of resolving objects as small as 6 inches. Campbell was arrested, tried, and convicted of espionage in 1978. During his trial, senior CIA officials testified that the manual Campbell sold to the Soviets had caused incalculable damage to American intelligence capabilities. The Soviets could now design camouflage specifically calibrated to defeat KH-11 sensors, schedule military activities to avoid satellite overflight windows, and construct underground facilities invisible to optical reconnaissance. Campbell was sentenced to 40 years in federal prison. The damage assessment conducted by the CIA concluded that while the manual provided the Soviets with precise knowledge of KH-11's capabilities, it did not fundamentally negate the satellite's value. The Soviets could hide some activities, but they could not hide everything. Large fixed installations such as ICBM silos, naval bases, and airfields were impossible to conceal entirely. Mobile systems such as SS-20 missiles could be hidden temporarily, but they had to be deployed to be useful, and deployment made them visible. The satellite continued to provide critical intelligence throughout the 1980s, though analysts had to develop new techniques for detecting camouflage targets and distinguishing real installations from decoys. Declassified intelligence assessments from the late 1970s reveal the scale of Soviet alarm. GRU reports noted that American intelligence had accurately identified the locations of SS-18 ICBM complexes under construction in the Ural Mountains, facilities that Soviet planners believed were hidden beneath forests and camouflage netting. KH-11 imagery exposed the construction vehicles, the concrete mixers, the excavation sites, and the missile transporter reactors positioned nearby. Analysts could count the number of silos, measure their dimensions, and assess their operational status. In one classified case, KH-11 satellites photographed a previously unknown submarine construction facility on the Kola Peninsula, revealing a new class of ballistic missile submarine under assembly. The images showed the hull sections, the missile tube compartments, and the propeller configuration, allowing American naval intelligence to assess the submarine's capabilities months before it entered sea trials. Soviet naval officers who later defected confirmed that the discovery of the facility forced a complete reassessment of Soviet operational security. They had believed the facility was invisible from space due to its indoor construction halls, but KH-11's oblique angle imaging capability allowed it to photograph through open bay doors and exposed sections of the hull during transport between buildings. The technical superiority of KH-11 extended beyond resolution. Earlier reconnaissance satellites were constrained by their film capacity. A KH-9 hexagon satellite could carry enough film for approximately 120 days of operations, but once the film was exhausted, the satellite was useless. KH-11 had no such limitation. Its CCD arrays did not degrade with use. The satellite could photograph targets indefinitely, constrained only by the lifespan of its mechanical components, solar panels, and orbital station-keeping fuel. The first KH-11 remained operational for 770 days, far exceeding the lifespan of any previous reconnaissance satellite. Later models extended operational lifetimes to over a decade, with some satellites remaining in orbit and transmitting imagery for more than 15 years. This persistence allowed continuous monitoring of Soviet military installations. Instead of waiting for the next scheduled satellite pass, analysts could task KH-11 to photograph a target repeatedly over days, weeks, or months, building detailed assessments of construction progress, deployment schedules, and operational patterns. The satellite's operational flexibility transformed intelligence analysis. Film-return satellites followed predetermined flight plans, photographing targets according to a priority list established weeks in advance. If a crisis erupted or new intelligence revealed an unexpected threat, analysts had to wait for the next scheduled mission to photograph the target. KH-11 could be retasked within hours. Ground controllers transmitted new imaging instructions via the Satellite Data System Relay Network, and the satellite adjusted its pointing mirrors to photograph the requested target on its next orbital pass. This capability proved invaluable during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979. As Soviet airborne divisions flew into Kabul and armored columns crossed the border from Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan, KH-11 satellites photographed the invasion in real time. Analysts tracked the movement of individual tank battalions, identified the types of aircraft landing at Kabul airport, and monitored the establishment of supply depots and forward operating bases. The intelligence was delivered to the White House within hours, allowing President Carter to convene the National Security Council with precise, current information about the scale and objectives of the Soviet operation. Soviet technical intelligence agencies attempted to reverse-engineer the KH-11's capabilities by analyzing its orbital behavior, radio emissions, and optical characteristics. Ground-based telescopes in the Soviet Union photographed the satellite as it passed overhead, revealing its size, shape, and configuration. These observations confirmed that KH-11 was substantially larger than previous American reconnaissance satellites and appeared to use a Cassegrain telescope designed similar to those used in astronomical observatories. Soviet engineers calculated that the satellite's power output based on the size of its solar panels was sufficient to operate high-bandwidth transmitters capable of sending gigabits of data per second. This confirmed their worst fear. The Americans had developed a real-time reconnaissance system, but knowing the satellite's capabilities did not provide a means to defeat it. The Soviet Union launched its own electro-optical reconnaissance satellites, known as the Yantar series, beginning in 1982. These satellites used film that was scanned and transmitted to ground stations, a hybrid approach similar to the American Frog concept that had been rejected in favor of KH-11. The Yantar satellites achieved resolutions comparable to KH-11, but their film capacity limited their operational lifespan to months rather than years, and their transmission rates were slower, resulting in delays between image capture and analyst review. Soviet reconnaissance remained a generation behind American capability. The strategic consequences of KH-11 extended beyond military intelligence. The satellite played a critical role in arms control verification, providing the imagery necessary to confirm Soviet compliance with the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaties signed in 1972 and 1979. American negotiators had insisted on provisions allowing national technical means of verification, a euphemism for satellite reconnaissance, to monitor Soviet missile deployments, test launches, and warhead counts. KH-11 imagery provided the evidence. When Soviet negotiators claimed they had dismantled a specific number of SS-9 ICBMs, as required by the treaty, American analysts used KH-11 photographs to verify that the silos had been destroyed and the missiles removed. When disputes arose over whether a new Soviet missile system violated treaty limits, KH-11 imagery allowed analysts to measure the missile's dimensions, count the number of warheads, and assess its throw weight, providing objective data that resolved the disagreement. Without KH-11, arms control agreements would have been unverifiable and therefore politically impossible. The satellite transformed arms control from an exercise in trust to a process grounded in empirical observation. The satellite also provided critical intelligence during regional conflicts. In 1981, when Israeli aircraft destroyed Iraq's Osirak nuclear reactor, KH-11 imagery confirmed the extent of the damage and revealed that the reactor core had been obliterated, eliminating Iraq's plutonium production capability. In 1983, KH-11 satellites photographed the construction of Soviet SA-5 missile sites in Syria, allowing American intelligence to assess the threat to Israeli aircraft and plan countermeasures. In 1984, a classified KH-11 image of a Soviet aircraft carrier under construction at a Black Sea shipyard was leaked to Jane's Defense Weekly by naval intelligence analyst Samuel Loring Morrison. The published photograph stunned the public and the intelligence community. It showed the carrier in extraordinary detail, revealing the arrangement of flight deck elevators, the configuration of defensive weapons, and the layout of radar arrays. Morrison was convicted of espionage and sentenced to 2 years in prison. The publication of the imagery forced the National Reconnaissance Office to reassess operational security procedures and tighten controls on access to satellite photographs. Despite this compromise, KH-11 remained operational and continued to provide critical intelligence throughout the final decade of the Cold War. Soviet military officers who defected to the West in the 1980s provided first-hand accounts of the psychological impact KH-11 had on Soviet operational planning. One GRU officer, whose identity remains classified, described the pervasive sense of vulnerability that gripped Soviet commanders once they understood that American satellites could see their deployments in real time. He explained that Soviet war plans during the Cold War relied on surprise and speed. In the event of conflict, Soviet armored divisions would mass along the border with West Germany, break through NATO defenses in a rapid offensive, and reach the Rhine River before NATO could mobilize reinforcements. The success of this strategy depended on concealing the buildup until the attack was imminent. Against film-return satellites, Soviet planners believed they could achieve tactical surprise by conducting the buildup at night, using camouflage and relying on the multi-day delay in reconnaissance to launch the attack before NATO received warning. Against KH-11, that assumption collapsed. American satellites could photograph Soviet tank columns as they moved into position, transmit the imagery to NATO headquarters within hours, and allow alliance forces to begin mobilizing while Soviet units were still en route to their staging areas. The defector stated that by the mid-1980s, Soviet war plans had been revised to assume that NATO would have real-time intelligence on all major Soviet troop movements, fundamentally altering the operational calculus of a potential conflict in Europe. The technical evolution of KH-11 continued throughout the 1980s and 90s. The second-generation satellites, launched beginning in 1982 and codenamed Crystal, incorporated larger CCD arrays with improved sensitivity, allowing them to capture images in lower light conditions and achieve resolutions approaching 10 centimeters. The third-generation satellites, designated KH-11 Block II and later referred to by outside observers as Advanced KENNEN or Improved Crystal, featured enhanced data transmission capabilities, onboard image processing to reduce bandwidth requirements, and upgraded optics with primary mirrors measuring 3 meters in diameter. These improvements extended the satellite's operational range, allowing them to photograph targets from higher altitudes and reducing the risk of detection by ground-based radars. The fourth-generation satellites, known officially as Evolved Enhanced Crystal System and launched beginning in the early 2000s, incorporated infrared sensors, multispectral imaging, and synthetic aperture radar, allowing them to penetrate clouds, photograph targets at night, and detect camouflaged installations based on thermal signatures. By the end of the Cold War, KH-11 satellites could photograph any point on Earth in any weather condition at any time of day, with resolutions sufficient to identify individual vehicles, weapon systems, and even personnel. The cost of the KH-11 program remains classified, but budget documents declassified in the 2000s reveal that the National Reconnaissance Office spent billions of dollars developing, launching, and operating the satellites. Each satellite cost approximately $1 billion to build, and launch costs added another several $100 million. Ground stations, data processing facilities, and relay satellites required additional investment. Over the course of 4 decades, the total expenditure likely exceeded $50 billion. Yet intelligence officials consistently assessed that the program provided value far exceeding its cost. A single KH-11 satellite could replace dozens of U-2 reconnaissance aircraft, eliminate the risk of pilot capture, and provide coverage of denied areas inaccessible to manned platforms. The imagery collected by KH-11 satellites informed every major national security decision made by American presidents from Carter through Obama, providing the evidence necessary to assess Soviet military capabilities, verify arms control compliance, monitor regional conflicts, and plan military operations. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, but KH-11 satellites did not. The program continued under successive administrations, with new satellites launched to replace aging systems and incorporate advancing technology. The satellites monitored the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, North Korea, and Iran, tracked terrorist training camps in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and provided imagery of conflict zones in the Balkans, the Middle East, and Africa. In 1998, KH-11 satellites photographed suspected chemical weapons facilities in Sudan and terrorist training camps in Afghanistan prior to cruise missile strikes ordered by President Clinton in response to the embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania. In 2003, KH-11 imagery was used to brief United Nations Security Council members on alleged Iraqi weapons of mass destruction programs, though the intelligence conclusions drawn from that imagery were later found to be erroneous. In 2011, a KH-11 satellite photographed Osama bin Laden's compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan, providing the imagery used to plan the raid that killed the al-Qaeda leader. In 2019, President Trump tweeted a photograph taken by a KH-11 satellite showing a failed Iranian rocket launch, inadvertently revealing the satellite's imaging capabilities to the world and prompting a fierce debate within the intelligence community about the compromise of classified information. If you appreciate discovering Cold War secrets hidden for decades, consider subscribing for future declassified revelations. As of 2025, descendants of the original KH-11 continue to operate in orbit. The exact number of satellites currently operational remains classified, but open-source analysts tracking satellite launches and orbital activity estimate that at least 4 KH-11 class satellites are in service, positioned in sun-synchronous polar orbits that allow them to photograph any point on Earth multiple times per day. The satellites are believed to have operational lifespans exceeding 15 years, with some systems potentially remaining functional for 2 decades or more. The imaging resolution of current generation satellites remains classified, but unclassified assessments suggest that the most advanced systems can resolve objects smaller than 5 centimeters, allowing analysts to identify specific models of vehicles, weapons, and equipment. The satellites incorporate infrared sensors, hyperspectral imaging, and advanced signal processing that can detect underground facilities, identify chemical signatures of weapons production, and penetrate sophisticated camouflage systems. The data transmission rates have increased exponentially since the first KH-11, with modern satellites capable of transmitting terabytes of imagery per day via laser communication links to relay satellites in geosynchronous orbit. Ground processing has been revolutionized by artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithms that can automatically identify targets, detect changes between successive images, and prioritize intelligence products for analyst review. What once required teams of photo interpreters spending hours analyzing images can now be accomplished by automated systems in minutes. The legacy of KH-11 is not merely technological. It represents a fundamental shift in the nature of intelligence and the balance of power during the Cold War. Before KH-11, reconnaissance was retrospective. Intelligence agencies could tell policymakers what the adversary had done, but not what the adversary was doing. Strategic warning was measured in days or weeks, providing adversaries with time to act before countermeasures could be implemented. After KH-11, reconnaissance became contemporaneous. Intelligence agencies could provide real-time assessments of adversary actions, enabling policymakers to respond to crises as they unfolded rather than after they had concluded. This capability fundamentally altered deterrence. Soviet planners could no longer assume that secrecy provided a decisive advantage. They understood that their deployments, exercises, and mobilizations would be observed, analyzed, and countered in near real time. That knowledge imposed caution, reducing the likelihood of miscalculation and surprise attack. In this sense, KH-11 contributed to the stability that prevented the Cold War from escalating into a hot war. It was a weapon that was never fired but whose presence altered the calculations of adversaries and shaped the strategic environment for half a century. The men and women who conceived, designed, built, launched, operated, and analyzed the product of KH-11 satellites worked in absolute secrecy. Their names do not appear in history books. Their contributions were not publicly acknowledged. They received no medals, no commendations, and no recognition beyond the classified halls of the intelligence community. Yet their work was among the most consequential of the Cold War. They built a system that allowed the United States to see what the Soviet Union tried to hide, to verify what the Kremlin claimed, and to respond to threats before those threats could materialize. They turned space into an arena of intelligence dominance and proved that technology, when paired with strategic vision, could shift the balance of power without firing a shot. Join us here at Classified Warfare as we uncover the operations and technologies that kept the world on the brink.